If you like history, Bible history, you're going to love this lesson. Last week, we encountered some wonderful spiritual and practical truths as we witnessed the great Eliyahu, pull himself off the mission field and essentially resign his calling as a prophet of Jehovah to the people of Israel. The Lord tried to teach him on Mount Horeb that it was Elijah's bad attitude. It was his carnal expectations for the results of the miracles that the Lord had done through Elijah. That was the problem. However, Eliyahu insisted that the Lord ought to be harsh upon Israel, meaning the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes, because he had done everything the Lord had told him to do. And the queen of Israel had threatened him with his life, and the bulk of the people still preferred idolatry to the pure worship of Jehovah. So this week, as we begin chapter 20, we find that Elijah is not even mentioned as the book of 1 Kings takes a detour into an important history lesson. However, do not take that to mean that the Lord was through with Elijah, because as we're going to find in chapters 21 and then 22 and then at the start of 2 Kings, apparently after some unknown amount of time, Eliyahu repented, he came to his senses, and the Lord began to use him again. And as we left chapter 19, Elijah had essentially appointed his replacement, Elisha, who was plowing his father's field using a team of oxen, and to express his fullest commitment to his new calling as a prophet, Elisha hosted a feast that used 2 oxen as the main dish, and he used their plow yokes as the wood for the roasting fire. And as we open chapter 20, the scene now shifts, and we find Israel is about to be attacked by an army from Aram, a region that is roughly synonymous with Syria today. So let's read 1 Kings chapter 20. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 395. 1 Kings chapter 20, if you have a complete Jewish Bible, page 395. Now, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, rallied his whole army, and with him were 32 kings, besides horses and chariots. Then he marched on Shomron, that's Samaria, and he laid siege to it. He sent messengers inside the city to Achav, king of Israel, to say to him, "Here is the message from Ben-Hadad. Your silver and gold are mine. Also your wives and your best children are mine." The king of Israel answered, "Just as you say, my lord king, I'm yours, along with everything I own." The messengers returned and said, "Well, here's Ben-Hadad's response. I sent you a message to hand over your silver, gold, wives, and children to me, but I am going to send my servants to you tomorrow around this time, and they will ransack your house, the house of your servants. Whatever they see that they like, they'll seize and remove." And then the king of Israel summoned all the leaders of the land and said, "Please take notice. Do you see how this man's trying to make trouble? First, he demanded my wives, children, silver, and gold, and I denied him nothing." All the leaders and all the people of Israel said to him, "Don't listen, don't agree." So he said to Ben-Hadad's messengers, "Tell my lord the king, I will do all that you asked of me the first time, but this I cannot do." The messengers left and brought word back to him. Ben-Hadad then sent his messengers this message to him: "May the gods do terrible things to me and worse ones as well, if there's enough dust in Samaria to give each of my followers a handful." The king of Israel answered, "Tell him, he who is putting on his armor shouldn't boast as if he were taking it off." It happened that Ben-Hadad received this message when he was drinking, he and his kings, in the field barracks, and he ordered his servants, "Take up your battle positions." So they got ready to attack the city. Well, at that moment, a prophet approached Achav, king of Israel, and said, "Here is what Adonai says. Have you seen this vast army? I'm going to give you victory over them today. Then you will know that I am Adonai." And Achav asked, "Well, who will defeat them?" And he answered, "This is what Adonai says, the young men who serve the district governors." And he asked, "Well, who will start the fighting?" And he answered, "You will." And he counted the district governor's young men. There were 232. And after that, he counted all the people. And all the people of Israel, there were 7,000. And they set out at noon. Now, Ben-Hadad was drinking himself senseless in the field barracks, he and his kings, the 32 kings who were his allies. The district governor's men went out first, and Ben-Hadad sent for information. And they reported, "Men have come out from Shimron." And he said, "Whether they have come out for peace or war, take them alive." So the district governor's men left the city, followed by the army, and each one killed his man. Aram fled. Israel pursued them. Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, escaped on horseback with some of the cavalry. The king of Israel went out and attacked the horses and chariots, inflicting a massive defeat on Aram. Afterwards, the prophet approached the king of Israel and said to him, "Go, regroup your forces. Think carefully what to do. For next year at this time, the king of Aram is going to renew his attack." Meanwhile, the servants of the king of Aram said to him, "Their God is a God of the hills. That's why they were stronger than we. But if we fight them on level ground, we will certainly be stronger than they are. Also do this. Remove all the kings from their commands and put professional officers in their place. Then recruit an army as big as the army you lost. Horse for horse, chariot for chariot. We'll attack them on level ground, and we will certainly be stronger than they." He heeded what they said and acted accordingly. Now, at the same time, the following year, Ben-Hadad mustered the army of Aram and went up to Aphek to attack Israel. And the army of Israel, already mobilized and supplied, went to meet them, but the army of Israel encamped opposite them looked like two herds of goats, while Aram filled the land. And at this point, a man of God approached, and he said to the king of Israel, "Here is what Adonai says. Because Aram said that Adonai is God of the hills, but not a God of the valleys, I will hand over to you this entire huge army. Then you'll know that I'm Adonai." Well, they remained in camp opposite each other for 7 days, and on the 7th day, the battle began. And the people of Israel killed 100,000 soldiers of Aram in a single day. The rest fled to Aphek in the city, and the wall fell on 27,000 of the men who were left. Ben-Hadad fled into the city, and he took refuge in an inside room, and his servant said to him, "Hear now. We have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. If it's all right with you, let's put sackcloth around our waists and ropes on our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Maybe he'll spare your life." So they put sackcloth around their waists and ropes on their heads and went out to the king of Israel and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad says, 'Please spare my life.'" And he answered, "He's still alive? Well, he's my brother." And the men took this as a promising indication, and they seized on it to say, "Yes, Ben-Hadad, he's your brother." And then Achav said, "Go bring him here." Ben-Hadad went out to him. Achav had climbed up into his chariot, and Ben-Hadad said to him, "I will return the cities my father took from your father. Also, you can set up markets for trade in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. If you put this covenant in writing, says Achav, I'll set you free." So he made a covenant with him and set him free. Now, one of the members of the prophets' guild said to another one, by the word of Adonai, "Hit me." Man refused to hit him. Then he said to him, "Because you didn't listen to the voice of Adonai, the moment you leave, a lion will kill you." And no sooner had he left him than a lion found him and killed him. The prophet went to another man and said, "Hit me." The man struck him a blow and wounded him. The prophet left and waited for the king by the road, disguising himself with a bandage over his eyes. And as the king passed by, he called out to the king and said, your servant was on his way into the thick of the fighting when someone turned and brought a man to me and said, guard this man. And if he's missing, you'll pay for his life with yours, or else you will pay 66 pounds of silver. But while your servant was busy with one thing and another, he disappeared. And the king of Israel said to him, so that's your sentence. You pronounced it on yourself. Quickly he removed the bandage from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of his prophets. Then he said to the king, here is what Adonai says, because you have let escape the man I had given over to be destroyed, you will pay with your life for his life, and with your people for his people. The king of Israel returned home to Shomron resentful, depressed. All right, let's try to get the time frame at least set for what's happening here. Remember that the two books of Kings tend to use synchronization between the reigns of Judah's kings and Israel's kings as the way it expresses time and then sequence of events. And although we're not given the number of years of his reign as a milestone, we do know that we're well into King Achav's reign in Israel, and that King Asa has continued to rule for many years in the south, down in Judah. Now, using modern calendar terms, we are probably around 860 BC. So it's only been about 60 years since King Solomon's death. And in that short time, the glorious unified kingdom of Israel was torn apart by civil war and split into two separate kingdoms of Judah and Israel, now starting to be known by an alternative name, Ephraim-Israel. And of course, that was the kingdom up in the north. Now, the northern kingdom under Jeroboam, who was the first king after the civil war and the split, set up calf worship, essentially using the golden calves as representations of Jehovah. And he also began honoring pagan idols. And upon setting up two calf worshiping centers, one up in Bethel and the other one up north further in Dan, King Jeroboam also barred his subjects from going to Jerusalem to worship at Solomon's temple, because he feared that if his citizens remained loyal to the temple in Judah, they'd eventually rebel against him and then try to reunite the two kingdoms under one king, more than likely a Judean king. Well, after going through half dozen more kings following Jeroboam, each one worse than the previous, most only ruling for a short time, Ephraim-Israel is currently being ruled by King Achav and his wicked wife, Jezebel. Now, this co-regency has taken the drastic step of virtually renouncing Yehovah as the national God of Israel and replacing him with Baal, mostly at Jezebel's insistence. And this was because Jezebel was from Sidon, where Baal was the chief deity. Now, King Achav was such a weak king, he was also a wicked king. It was Jezebel who was the real force behind this throne. And such projected weakness, of course, became apparent to Israel's enemies. And so it invited the neighboring kingdoms to do what came natural to them, expand their kingdom by invading and conquering another's, and that's what we see happening in this chapter. Well, Aram, what we could, for convenience sake, just call Syria, although Aram included a larger area than Syria. This was being ruled by a fellow named Ben-Hadad. Now, the word Hadad was actually more of a title of the office rather than this person's formal name. In other words, when we say Prime Minister so-and-so or President such and such, Prime Minister and President are just titles that those who came before them and those who will come after them usually inherit as the national leader. Ben, of course, means son. So this Hadad of our story was the son, the Ben, of the previous Hadad. Therefore, he's called Ben-Hadad. And Hadad is the name of the Syrian sun god, which was the chief deity of that kingdom. Now, as I will repeat to you many times in our study of the Old Testament, events in the Bible didn't happen in a vacuum. Even though the circumstances and context are not often included in the scriptures, these invasions and these killings and these decisions happen for a reason. So the first question we must ask ourselves upon reading the first verse of chapter 20 is, why did Ben-Hadad decide to attack Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom? And the short answer is that it had become the national policy of Syria, Aram, to weaken its neighbor Israel. But again, the question is why? To what end? Well, some years earlier, Ben-Hadad's father had made Syria an ally with Judah. And the king of Judah at that time was a king named Asa, who's, by the way, still king at the time of our story. But a few years later, Asa decided he didn't need or want Syria, Aram, as an ally any longer, and so he pulled away from them. And during that time, a fellow named Baasha became the king of Israel, and he saw an opening to strengthen himself then by making a treaty with Syria, whom Asa had just broken alliance with. And with that treaty in his pocket now, and his northern border secure, Baasha felt free to pursue his goal of attacking and conquering Judah without any interference from Syria. So he began by marching on Jerusalem. But when King Asa of Judah saw this, he panicked, and he immediately went to King Hadad of Syria, offered him huge sums of gold and silver if he would once again become Judah's ally. But it would be more in the sense of a vassal relationship with King Asa subservient to Hadad. But a condition of this renewed relationship was Hadad of Syria must now disavow his new peace treaty with Baasha of Israel. Hadad accepted the terms, and Baasha was suddenly hung out to dry. So, as we open our story in chapter 20, Syria, Aram, is an enemy of Israel, but it has a good relationship with Judah. Yet Syria now finds itself with a pressing problem. It is that Assyria is on its northern and eastern border, and Assyria was by now a growing and aggressive power. So Syria found itself caught between two enemies, Assyria to its north, Israel to its south. It was in a vice. And in geopolitical terms, that made them ripe as a target for territorial expansion, either by Israel or more likely from Assyria. So the new king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, son of Hadad, decided to make a preemptive strike at the heart of Israel. Their relatively new capital city of Samaria would be the target. This would essentially neuter Israel and make them no longer a threat. At least that was the hope. Well, Ben-Hadad's invasion force, however, was suspect because it consisted of 32 petty potentates, each of them supplying their own contingency of fighting men who were primarily loyal to them. Now, these potentates were just unruly barbarians with but one thing in mind: spoils of war. And these spoils of war would be either precious metals or valuable gems or kidnapped Hebrews that they would sell for slave labor, or everything if it all went well. They had no grand geopolitical strategy in mind, as did Ben-Hadad. They just wanted to loot and pillage and grab all they could and go home. Apparently, Ben-Hadad was persuasive in convincing all these leaders, these 32 kings, that they had nothing to fear. They'd have an easy time of it if they agreed to help him invade Israel. Well, see, this attack now caught King Achav of Israel completely by surprise. He was unprepared for this. And when he faced this overpowering army from Aram. He and his men ran into the fortress walls of Samaria and they hunkered down. And before beginning the siege, however, Ben-Hadad sent a message to King Achav, and he offered him his terms for surrender. King Achav, who no longer even remotely resembled the character and the pattern of a king that the Lord demanded the kings over his chosen people and land were to be, he was weak and he was frightened for his life. He heard the message from Ben-Hadad and essentially saw the demand of your silver and gold and your best women and children as meaning that this Syrian king was after in his invasion tribute and wealth, which was customary for that era. In other words, Achav saw Ben-Hadad's terms as Israel agreeing to become a vassal state that would now be controlled by Syria. And if accepted, King Achav and his family would not be killed, Israel would not be destroyed, and very likely Achav would remain in power. However, he would now be subservient to King Ben-Hadad. Now, of course, much of Israel's wealth would get transferred on a regular basis to Ben-Hadad, but King Achav saw that as an acceptable outcome. Well, Achav's answer is in verse 4. And he enthusiastically accepts the terms of surrender. But as happens so often in the world, past or present, appeasing an aggressive dictator merely leads to greater demands and even more loss of freedom. So after King Achav quickly agreed without reservation to these demands, Ben-Hadad became emboldened and he upped the ante. So he sends his envoys back to King Achav with another message that essentially says, I think you misunderstood me. I don't just want tribute. I intend on looting your kingdom of anything I choose, taking you out of power, taking everything that is dear to you away from you. And this new demand, you see, is all about humiliation. It is a personal and insulting thing, and it also involves the many tribal and clan leaders who stand to have their wealth and families taken from them too. See, it's interesting to me that we see this same pattern of events happening in Israel in our time. Same thing. Israel's enemies, the Palestinians, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and others, they not only want Israel's land, they want to humiliate Israel. Yet whose fault is that? It's Israel's. Because too often they've chosen to appease demands that are unreasonable, if not irrational. And each time a new demand is met, the enemy refuses to accept unless they receive even more the next time. Every demand, of course, involves more and more humiliation. And now that Israel has reached the end of what it can possibly give and still survive as a sovereign Jewish nation, now various world governments, including the USA, are putting pressure on Israel to accept demands that no other nation in the world would ever accept for peace terms. And although few might ever remember it, this whole process started in its current form in 1967, when the Israelis recaptured their holy city, Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount from Jordan. And on their own accord, in an attempt to appease Islam in the West, they actually agreed to give control over the Temple Mount back to Jordan for them to operate as an Islamic holy site. Now, how's that worked out? It's an error that haunts them to this day, and they don't seem to learn from it. Now, King Achav knew the demands were not going to stop coming, because part of Hadad's goal was apparently to punish, to denigrate Israel for some reason. So Achav knew he had a little choice but to go to Israel's elders and leaders and present them with this proposition. And they agreed. that Ben-Hadad's intent was not tribute. It was destruction, and it was servitude. And so they told King Achav not to give in to it. And Achav told the messengers that he remained committed to Hadad's first demand, but not the second. Doesn't all this sound familiar to what we hear on the news constantly? And when Hadad heard that message, in verse 10, why, he was furious over the reply, and he swore an oath to his gods that he was going to rain down terrible destruction on Samaria. That was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. He even boasted that his army was so numerous that there won't be enough dust left in Samaria for each soldier to return home with even a bag full as a souvenir of their exploit. The king of Israel replies to Hadad's boast with that Middle Eastern equivalent of, don't be counting your chickens before they hatch, buddy. But verse 12 explains that part of the reason for this over-the-top offensive language by Ben-Hadad was he was drunk. He was in the middle of a drunken party with his 32 drunken potentates, and as the males of our species generally have a bad habit of doing, he needed to thump his chest and show off a little bit for his drinking buddies. It says that this drinking bout was taking place in huts, Sukkot. And despite what some rabbis have tried to make of this remark, this use of the term Sukkot has no religious connotation to it here at all. It merely meant that while the soldiers were probably in tents, the leaders had temporary huts made for them that were a lot more comfortable and to their liking. Now remember, they had set up a camp that they felt they would be in for anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. See, this is the nature of siege warfare, such that it is usually a waiting game for the trapped and the besieged city to run out of food and water and have little choice but to surrender. Alternatively, the purpose for all those high defensive walls around the city is to hold off that attacking enemy until weather eventually drives them out, or they just tire of the siege or help comes from some ally and now they're rescued. Well, suddenly, a prophet from Yehovah comes to King Achav. And verse 13 ought to read, behold, because the Hebrew word that starts it out is hine. And when we see this word, it's for the purpose of saying, heads up, pay attention. What's coming is important. And this anonymous Navi, prophet, tells the king that the Lord is going to deliver outmanned Israel from what can only be certain annihilation at the hands of this enormous army of Aram. And Achav's only question was, through whom? And the rabbis say that this wasn't that Achav instantly accepted on faith that God was going to deliver them. Rather, it was an expression of skepticism, something of despair that meant something like, right, now how exactly are we going to be delivered from that huge unstoppable force that's standing out there and who's going to lead this effort? And the Navi responded that it would be through some youthful sons of the officers of the provinces. And then Achav, King Achav asked, well, okay, good. Well, now who's going to lead this battle? The prophet said, you. Now, one must know who these youthful sons of the provincial governors were to understand a King Ahav's shock at the suggestion of using them as military leaders. See, it's nearly unanimous among the ancient Hebrew sages and even later rabbis that these provincial governors were government officials over taxation districts that had been set up within the northern kingdom, a system borrowed from the Gentile nations, and by the way, was first implemented in Israel by King Solomon. And their sons were essentially involuntary guests of the king, who were being held more or less hostage in Samaria to guarantee that King Achav wouldn't be deserted by these well-to-do men when that massive army from Aram shows up. But the spiritual point is that these youthful men, they were in no way qualified to act as soldiers, let alone lead units of an army. And as to the prophet instructing Achav that he would lead the battle, hopefully, we're all getting the picture that King Achav was no David. Most kings, decent kings, even Gentile kings, they would never think to ask such a question, who's going to lead the battle? It was expected that a king would lead his men into critical battles. But Achav is a type of Middle Eastern monarch who was only in it for the comfort and wealth and the prestige. He had no interest in getting his hands dirty, taking any personal risks. He was no leader of men. So the idea is, it's humanly impossible that Israel could be rescued by a weakling of a king and a bunch of youth trying to lead soldiers into a battle against impossible odds. Any victory for Israel then can only miraculously come from Israel's God. Well, inside the walls of Samaria, Shomron, were 232 of these young sons and 7,000 men capable of fighting to some level or another. Now, these are not the 7,000 people, the same 7,000 who'd bowed down to Baal that was spoken of when Elijah was at Horeb. This 7,000 is a round number. So it's symbolic of a force that's being divinely put together and led. Now, around noontime, these 232 men led a contingency of Hebrew soldiers out of the city gates from behind those defensive walls, and they marched towards where all those Syrians were encamped. And the move startled the Syrian scouts who were watching the Israelites' movements in and around Samaria, and they immediately went to Ben-Hadad with the news. Well, the inebriated and overconfident king of Aram not only didn't sense any danger, his only thought was whether to take these men alive or just go ahead and kill them outright. And his decision was to capture them all. No doubt he intended to humiliate them as slaves, and this was since their leaders were the sons of government officials. How much more humiliating would that be? But the results weren't quite what Ben-Hadad had envisioned. Israel's army simply mowed down the Syrian troops that were really just a rabble of men who came to steal and to pillage. They certainly weren't there to die for Ben-Hadad's ambitions. They panicked, they fled, and King Ben-Hadad did the same. And in verse 21, we find out that King Achav continued to behave in his usual character. He disobeyed the oracle from God, and he did not lead his men into battle. Only after the battle was won, and after Aram was in flight, did he come out to participate and take the credit. But immediately after this stunning victory, the anonymous prophet returns to Achav, not with a reproof for his disobedience and cowardice, but with a warning. King, this isn't over yet. The king of Aram is going to regroup, and he's going to return at the end of the year. Now, this turn of the year, from a Hebrew perspective, is either in the fall of the 7th month, which is the change of the civil calendar, or it might be in the spring according to the agricultural and religious calendar. See, Nisan is the first month of the year, and this is springtime. And in springtime, this was a traditional time when most armies marched out to lay siege and do battle because the weather allowed for better chariot movement and easier passage of the army through mountain passes. However, the early fall was also conducive for battle because it was after the scorching hot summer months, but before the winter rains and snows began. So it's hard to know which is being referred to here. But the prophet's advice was, King, strengthen your defenses and prepare because this battle is absolutely coming. And after arriving back home in Syria, now, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, got together with his royal court to ponder such an improbable loss to such a weak, puny, undermanned enemy. Well, the intent to humiliate Israel has now backfired. And no doubt the whole Middle East was abuzz with this embarrassing defeat of Ben-Hadad at the hands of such a small force of Hebrews. Well, Ben-Hadad had no choice but to try again, or he would have to live with this shame for the rest of his reign. The only answer for such an unlikely defeat had to lie in the power of Israel's God, reasons Ben-Hadad's advisors, but there is a very clever solution for this. See, they say, look, king, their God is the God of the mountains. So, that's why in the mountains they are so strong. Let's fight them in the plains. We'll do that, because then their mountain God can't help them. Now, first, it isn't, or rather, I guess it is usual that we will look at anyone else, to try to find explanation for our problems and failures rather than looking in the mirror. That's just human. Second, don't we tend to rationalize about our misfortunes such that if only this or that had been different, everything would have turned out as it was supposed to? See, it's ironic that the leaders of Aram were actually on to the truth when they suspected that it was Israel's God that had to be the answer to all this. But they also allowed their pagan beliefs to lead them to conclude that Israel's God had boundaries and limitations. So you know what? We'll just go around him and outfox him. But let's not let something else fly by us. It was reasonable and ancient thinking that gods were territorial. They had geographical limits to where they operated. But why would they think that Israel's God was the God of the mountains? Well, for one thing, at this time especially, Israel had their altars scattered everywhere. And it had always been Hebrew custom to put their altars on a bama, a high place. So when the Israelites of the northern kingdom performed their sacrifices and religious rites, they invariably did it on hilltops, on mountain slopes, indicating this is where their God lives. But there's also that matter of God's most ancient name in the Bible, El Shaddai. And as we have discussed on more than a few occasions, El Shaddai is now known to probably mean mountain. God's first known name to the Hebrews was indeed God of the mountain. So it all made perfect sense. And the logical conclusion for Ben-Hadad was, let's fight in the plains and avoid the mountains because God lives up there. Makes sense to me. But there was another issue. Those 32 potentates, those 32 kings whose men turned and ran when facing forces consisting of only a fraction of their own. These 32 potentates had no interest in doing anything except collecting spoils of war. And no doubt had been sold the story that the battle was going to be minor, or likely no battle at all would happen, because King Achav's reputation was that he'd simply cave in at the first sign of trouble. So Ben-Hadad's solution was to, this next time, appoint seasoned soldiers to lead the other men and create an army not from the personal armies of those 32 petty kings, but hand-picked fighters. He would also rearm with horses and chariots before they went back to fight Israel. Well, the time came, and after doing a census of his army, Ben-Hadad led his soldiers to Israel in the plain of Jezreel. And he took his men to the city of Aphek. And when word came to Israel's military commanders that the armies of Aram were coming again, they mobilized to go and meet them. But when Israel came, they were again so few in number as compared to Ben-Hadad's giant forces that verse 27 says their encampment looked like two little herds of goats. Well, verse 28 says that a man of God, an Ish Elohim, showed up. And he spoke to the king of Israel. Now, it's likely that this Ish Elohim, this man of God, is the same as this anonymous Navi, this prophet who had been bringing God's oracle all this time to King Achav. So he serves the same function here of bringing Jehovah's message to the king. And the message is this. Now, Jehovah says that because Aram believes that God is only capable of defending Israel up in the mountains, they're going to soon find out that he's God of Israel's plains as well. He is going to defeat Ben-Hadad's forces, and then King Achav will understand that Jehovah is Israel's true God. Now, it's instructional to me that just as the Lord had tried to teach Elijah at Mount Horeb, that he will continue to try to bring his chosen people to repentance in gentle ways, rather than raining down wrath upon them. So here we see that God's going to use this demonstration of destructive power on the army of Syria so that King Achav would see it and realize God's mercy for him. Then hopefully he'd repent and be turned from his wickedness and idolatry. Well, after a 7-day stare down, the battle begins. And the results were essentially the same as the first time. Most Bibles say that Israel killed 100,000 Syrian soldiers in one day. That's not a good translation. What it says is they nasa 100,000 soldiers. Nasa doesn't mean to kill. It means to smite. In other words, some of them were killed, some of them were wounded, some were captured, others of them fled. They routed 100,000 men in battle. That's what it means. Therefore, of that 100,000 man army, we're told that 27,000 of them escaped and they fled to the walled city of Aphek. Now, we're not told if the collapse of Aphek's walls was a direct intervention by God or that it was in consequence of the battle. However, the wall fell and either killed or injured many of these remaining 27,000, thus bringing an end to the battle. Well, in the interior of that city, Ben-Hadad was trying to avoid capture. So he moved from house to house. But as the inevitable neared, Ben-Hadad's personal guard suggested that they plead for mercy on his behalf and maybe the king will survive. Now, the idea was not that the idea was that they had heard that Israel's kings usually showed mercy when other nations' kings didn't. The word usually translated in mercy is in Hebrew chesed. Usually it's better rendered as deeds of loving kindness. But to put their theory to a test, they volunteered to don sackcloth and then put ropes around their necks and then go to the king of Israel and ask for mercy. Now, sackcloth was symbolic of mourning. The ropes around their necks signaled that they had already accepted a status of captured slaves if the king would just allow them to live. But they could hardly have hoped for the reception that they received from King Achav. When they gave to King Achav the content of Ben-Hadad's message begging to be pardoned, the king responds to referring to Ben-Hadad as my brother and instructed the men to bring the king of Aram to him. The men assumed that this was the best of omens, so they brought King Hadad to King Achav's chariot, and King Achav himself reached out a friendly hand to help Ben-Hadad aboard the royal chariot. King Achav proved himself to be a rash fool. A rash fool. Utterly unworthy of being king over God's people. This man he was warming to was an arch enemy of Israel who sought nothing but to humiliate and annihilate. And when King Achav captures him, what's his thought? Only to make him a friend, even an equal. That is the meaning behind calling him brother and having Ben-Hadad stand there with him on his royal chariot. My head reels as I think back to the many times that Israel's modern day prime ministers have shaken the hand of their sworn enemies in supposed friendship, only to turn and in no time be stabbed in the back. Over and over and over it happens, even with that murdering and unrepentant terrorist Yasser Arafat and now Mahmoud Abbas. It boggles the mind how anybody could be so blind. Yet, all nations seem to occasionally suffer under poor national leaders who think that capitulation and appeasement and intentional weakness in the face of brutal and evil enemies, that will lead to peace and harmony. Achav must be one of the best biblical examples of such childish but dangerous naivety, and nothing about it mirrors godliness. A covenant of peace was sealed between King Ben-Hadad and King Achav, and part of the bargain was that several cities that Ben-Hadad's father had taken up in the Galilee region of Israel would be returned. And then Israel would be given markets for their produce and goods up in Damascus, Syria. Upon that, King Achav released Ben-Hadad. And we'll continue with this chapter next time. Please rise.